Welcome and welcome back. I'm B. Today we're diving into one of horror's most iconic figures, Nosferatu. I'll be ranking all three films. The original silent classic from 1922, directed by F.W. Murnau, Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire from 1979, and the 2024 remake directed by Robert Eggers. Each version of the story brings its own flavor, from the haunting shadows of the original to Herzog's melancholic retelling and Eggers' modern reimagining. Ranking these movies was harder than I expected. I went back and forth so many times about which one should take the second and third spots, and honestly, I'll probably change my mind after this video. But for now, here's how I'm ranking them. Coming in at number 3 is Nosferatu the Vampire. It's definitely an interesting take on the Nosferatu story, but for me, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Let's start with the atmosphere. Herzog creates this eerie, dreamlike vibe that feels heavy and unsettling. The desolate streets of Wismar, Dracula's crumbling castle, and the use of silence and stillness all add to the feeling that the world is slowly decaying. And I have to say, the opening scene with the mummified bodies and that haunting music really stuck with me. It sets such an eerie tone right from the start. Visually, the film has moments that stand out, but it leans more towards being artistic than truly horrifying. The muted color palette and detailed set design work well for the melancholic tone Herzog was going for. But I prefer something grittier and more menacing for a Nosferatu adaptation. Then there's the portrayal of Count Dracula. Klaus Kinski definitely makes an impression. He's unsettling and strange, but his Dracula is so melancholic and pitiful that it doesn't work for me. Herzog humanizes him to the point where he feels more like a tragic cursed figure than a terrifying monster. I just prefer my Nosferatu to be this ruthless, predatory force that's completely evil and relentless. The humanized, lovesick vampire angle takes away the fear and menace that I think makes the character so iconic. As for the other performances, Isabelle Adjani as Lucy has this haunting, ethereal presence that fits the tone of the movie, but her character doesn't get much to do. It's like she's more of a symbol than a fully realized character. Bruno Ganz as Jonathan Harker is fine, but his performance didn't leave a strong impression on me. Overall, Nosferatu the Vampire has its moments, but it just doesn't capture what I personally love about Nosferatu. It's more melancholy and artistic than dark and horrifying. And while I can appreciate what Herzog was going for, it's not what I look for in a Nosferatu film. At number 2, I have Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. I recently did a spoiler-free review of this movie on my channel, so I'm not going to dive too deep here. If you want my detailed thoughts, feel free to check that out. What I will say is that the cinematography is the strongest part of the movie. The visuals are stunning, with beautifully framed and lit scenes that create an eerie gothic atmosphere. As for the performances, Lily Rose Depp's physical acting, especially during the possession scenes, was well done, but her overall performance as Ellen Hutter wasn't particularly memorable. Nicholas Hoult as Thomas Hutter delivered a solid portrayal of fear and helplessness, while Willem Dafoe as the professor was my favorite. He completely commanded every scene he was in. When it comes to Count Orlok, Bill Skarsgård's performance was fine, but I wasn't a fan of how the character was portrayed or designed. Eggers' vision of aligning Orlok with Bram Stoker's Dracula makes sense, but I personally prefer the monstrous, terrifying look of the 1922 version. Overall, while the movie has some strong visuals and performances, it didn't capture the dread and terror that made the original Nosferatu so unforgettable. And finally, my number 1 pick is Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, 1922. There's so much to love about this movie. It's honestly a masterpiece of horror. The atmosphere is just unmatched. It's haunting, eerie, and full of dread. From start to finish, you feel like you're trapped in a nightmare, and that's exactly what I want in a Nosferatu movie. Max Schreck as Count Orlok is incredible. His movements are so unnatural, like he's something that doesn't belong in our world. There's this air of creepiness about him, and you can't take your eyes off the screen whenever he's there. And the design of Count Orlok, it's monstrous, weird, downright terrifying. Those long fingers, the rat-like features, the gaunt face, it all comes together to create a creature that's the stuff of nightmares. And I heard that there was a rumor that Max Schreck was actually a vampire, and I can see why people thought that, because the design was just so great, and the way that he acted it, he did it so well. One of the things that really stands out to me in this movie is the use of shadows. The way the shadows are used in this film creates such a dreadful, intense atmosphere. The infamous shadow scene where Orlok climbs the stairs and all you see is his elongated shadow on the wall, that moment is iconic for a reason. It's so simple, but it's one of the scariest things that I've ever seen. Another unforgettable scene is when Orlok rises from his coffin, stiff as a board. It's so unnatural and creepy, it gives me chills every time. I also have to say, I actually enjoy the overdramatic acting. Silent films rely so much on exaggerated expressions and movements to tell the story, and for me, it works perfectly here. It adds to the surreal, otherworldly vibe of the movie. And for a film from 1922, the special effects are surprisingly well done. I love the use of stop motion for Orlok's carriage, where it looks like it's moving on its own, and how they make Orlok's movements unnaturally fast in some scenes. These effects may seem simple today, but they were groundbreaking at the time and still hold up in creating an unsettling atmosphere. There's a reason Nosferatu has stood the test of time. It's creepy, innovative, and so influential in horror. No matter how many times I watch it, it still gives me that feeling of unease, and for that, it will always be my favorite version of Nosferatu. Now, before we wrap up, let's talk about some of the background of Nosferatu and how it connects to Bram Stoker's Dracula. So Stoker's Dracula was first published on May 26, 1897. As mentioned before, Nosferatu was directed by F.W. Murnau. It's often considered the first vampire movie, but what makes it so interesting is that it was an unauthorized adaptation of Dracula. And so all of the other movies to come, Nosferatu the Vampire and Eggers' Nosferatu, is based on Dracula, but it's also based on the original Nosferatu in 1922. So these are adaptations of adaptations. So going back to Nosferatu 1922, the production company Prana Film wanted to adapt Bram Stoker's novel but didn't secure the rights from his estate. To try and get around this, they changed the names and some details in the story. Count Dracula became Count Orlok. Jonathan Harker became Thomas Hutter, and Mina Murray became Ellen Hutter. Lucy Westenra was renamed Ruth and has a much smaller role in the movie compared to her major role in Dracula. Renfield was transformed into Knock, Orlok's creepy servant. Even the setting was changed. Instead of England, much of the story takes place in Germany, specifically in the fictional town of Wisborg. Nosferatu and Dracula still share many similarities. Both stories follow a vampire who leaves their home to spread terror in a new land. Key plot elements such as the journey to Transylvania, the vampire preying on a couple, and the eventual destruction of the vampire are present in both. Themes of death, plague, and supernatural are central to the narratives, making the two works closely tied in their core ideas. However, there are also notable differences that goes beyond changing the characters' names. Dracula is more of a complex, ensemble-driven story with multiple perspectives, while Nosferatu narrows its focus on the tragic relationship between Count Orlok, Ellen, and Hutter. Despite these changes, the film follows the plot of Dracula closely enough that Stoker's widow, Florence Stoker, wasn't happy about this. She sued Prana Film for copyright infringement, and the courts ruled in her favor. As a part of the ruling, all copies of Nosferatu were supposed to be destroyed. Luckily, a few prints survived, which is why we can still watch the film today. And in a way, Nosferatu is a piece of horror history that almost disappeared. Despite its unauthorized origins, Nosferatu has become one of the most iconic vampire films ever made. It set the template for so many vampire movies that came after it, and even though it's technically not Dracula, its influence on vampire mythology is undeniable. Alright, folks, so that's my ranking of the Nosferatu films. How would you rank these films? Do you agree with me that Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, reigns supreme? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more horror content.